Hey there. Welcome to the SBC Daily Word for Monday, February 22nd, 2021. Having finished our time in the letter of James, we're now going to begin a new series of expositions of the Psalms of Ascent. That's a little collection of books near the end of the book of Psalms that take us from Psalms 120 to 134. So tomorrow we're going to begin with just a simple exposition and application of Psalm 120. Right now, what we're going to do is kind of get a big picture understanding of this collection of 15 Psalms. There's two resources aside from the scriptures that have really informed the way that I look at the book of Psalms, and especially this collection of the book of Psalms. I don't have one of these resources in front of me, but my sister got me this 3-volume collection of expositions of the entire book of Psalms by John Goldengay of Fuller Seminary. A great, helpful resource. There's a smaller commentary that I'll be using quite a bit during this series by Walter Brueggemann. And then here's this wonderful little book by Eugene Peterson. Let me see if you can see that there. It's called A Long Obedience, and then the fuller title is A Long Obedience in the Same Direction. And then on the paperback version of this, it has a subtitle. It's called Discipleship in an Instant Society. And that title, in a lot of different ways, tells the story of that wonderful, helpful book that Eugene Peterson has written, which is actually a series of meditations on each one of the Songs of Ascent. So just full disclosure, I don't come up with this stuff on my own. I have conversations like John Goldengay, Walter Brueggemann, and Eugene Peterson have been very helpful for me. In his introduction to this section in the book of Psalms, Walter Brueggemann says this: Psalm 120 begins a series of 15 psalms, again, Psalms 120 to 134, that bear the superscription Psalm of Ascent. So if you look in your English Bible, usually under the title Psalm 120, and then all the way Psalm 121, Psalm 122, all the way to Psalm 134, there is a superscription, which means just a smaller little title. And then in our English Bibles, it usually says something like a Song of Ascent. Now, that, I don't believe, and a lot of scholars with a lot more degrees and a lot more smarts than me believe that within the original authorship of those Psalms, verse 1 is often that heading. So in each of these Psalms, the first verse, even though our English translations don't follow this, the first line is a Song of Ascent. Okay? So Brueggemann continues. It is likely that these 15 psalms constitute an earlier collection used within a particular liturgical community. So that's a fancy phrase for, this is like a small hymn book that probably in its earliest stages was a part of one specific gathering of people. Okay? He continues. Most plausibly, the collection was used liturgically by pilgrims who were on their way to the Jerusalem temple. So as we're calling this the Songs of Ascent or the Psalms of Ascent, what we're doing is we're taking seriously that first superscription, that first verse, and then we're reading these in light of the context in which they were originally used. They were originally used to be sung, and both Brueggemann and Eugene Peterson agree that they were probably sung in sequence. So as this journey began with your family, with your extended family, from your hometown to the Jerusalem temple, it was kind of like a playlist. You know how that works? Now we can put those on our phones and then sync that up to our car stereo, or we can plug in our phone, or back in my day, you used to burn a CD, or even back like when I was in high school and college, you would make a mixtape for a road trip. Okay? There's a wonderful little movie called Elizabethtown, and the soundtrack on that is amazing because that soundtrack is connected to this journey, okay, that the main character played by Orlando Bloom has to take as he takes his dad's remains on this road trip that he is supposed to take. And there's some great songs by Tom Petty and Elton John, and it's this whole playlist for this very significant journey that this young man in a desperate place in his life really needs to take for him to heal and for him to grieve and for him to become what he is intended to become in the next stage of his life. I don't want to ruin the movie for you, but he has a crisis at the beginning of the movie, and then he can't seem to get out from under that shadow until he takes this road trip. And connected to this road trip is this playlist. This playlist that the character played by Claire Danes makes for him. And then it's just this great, healing, beautiful story that then is connected to a journey with music. Okay? So that's kind of what we have here. We have this playlist for the journey to Jerusalem. Okay? So again, we're just going to be looking at a few themes that kind of help us maybe understand the whole group. And then tomorrow we'll begin with Psalm 120. So just a couple of principles that I think we need to think about. One, the Psalms of Ascent are for discipleship. Okay? One author puts it this way. One aspect of world, so he's just talked about those three enemies that all Christians have, the world, the flesh, and the devil. He says, one aspect of world that I have been able to identify as harmful to Christians is the assumption that anything worthwhile can be acquired at once. Okay? That subtitle was Discipleship in an Instant Society. So again, we live in this world where we think worthwhile things can just come immediately. One of the conversations that Linda and I have had recently about the COVID experience and then looking into the future for a post-COVID experience, we've gotten really used to ordering things online and then just having those things delivered to us. Especially if you're a Prime member, Amazon can get that thing to you in a day or at the most 2. And when you have that option, why take the journey to Walmart? Why go to Target? Why go shopping for those clothes at Kohl's when it can just be received so easily and so quickly? Brothers and sisters, that is the pattern of our world right now, and it's squeezing us into a mold that Psalms 120 to 134, the Songs of Ascent, push against. That no, it is this slow journey that we must be patient with. And sadly, secondly, the world squeezes us into that mold. It is not difficult, Peterson says, in such a world to get a person interested in the message of the gospel. It is terrifically difficult to sustain that interest. Millions of people in our culture make decisions for Christ, but there is a dreadful attrition rate. Many claim to have been born again, but the evidence for mature discipleship is slim. In our kind of culture, anything, even news about God, can be sold if it is packaged freshly. But when it loses its novelty, it goes on the garbage heap. There is a great market for religious experience in our world. There is little enthusiasm for the patient acquisition of virtue, little inclination to sign up for a long apprenticeship in what earlier generations called holiness. See, we have this notion in our culture of a tourist mindset. The idea that religion is this thing that I'm kind of going to go visit and then go back to my normal life. I'm going to visit when things are all good and easy, but then I go back to my normal life. Beloved, this is the situation. I'll just talk about our church that we find ourselves in. It's just so easy to wake up on Sunday morning and just to think, yeah, do I really want to have to make the drive? Do I really want to have to put on pants? Do Do I really want to, not be able to control the volume of the pastor with my remote control? And there's just kind of this tourist mindset that, yeah, when everything's good, when everything's easy, when we're not so worried about the virus, etc. Now, again, many of us have legitimate reasons that making it to an in-person service is difficult and maybe not advised. But I do think it's helpful for us to recognize that there are forces at work in the world that are squeezing us into this convenience and tourist mindset, and they want religion to be thought of in that way. The Songs of Ascent push against that, and they begin this long, arduous journey that's going to have difficulty, that's going to have suffering, but ultimately it leads to the house of God. Ultimately, it leads to atonement and forgiveness. The Songs of Ascent squeeze us instead into a mindset that says, I am ultimately a disciple. I am ultimately a pilgrim. Okay? I am following Jesus, who is the road to the house of God. And this world as it is a world in which I consider myself a pilgrim. Furthermore, the Songs of Ascent assume that within the worship life of a church, there is this calendar that regularly calls God's people on a journey that they may be reminded by the way that they keep time, that what is most important is the destiny to which we are headed. At least 3 times throughout the liturgical year, the Jewish calendar, everything would cease, and God's people, if possible, would take a journey. In the spring, they would take the journey to Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Passover. In the summer, they would take the journey to Jerusalem to celebrate Pentecost, the time where they remembered God giving them Torah. And then in autumn, they would celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. Now we think, well, that's for them. What about for us? Well, if you consider yourself, and I hope you do, a follower of Jesus, Jesus followed that calendar. You read in Luke 2, early in his life, they made the journey to Jerusalem. You read in Mark chapter 10, verse 32, Jesus says to his disciples, we're heading to Jerusalem because Passover is about to take place. So brothers and sisters, that's why we as a congregation have felt it wise to have some type of connection to what we know in our culture as the Christian calendar. This idea of the Christian year beginning with Advent, waiting to then celebrate Christmas, which is then this feast of 12 days where we celebrate the light of the world coming into the world, and then Christmas being followed by Epiphany, this manifestation of Jesus, the light of the world. And then now we've begun this journey through Lent, which takes us into Holy Week, which takes us into Eastertide, which then takes us into Pentecost, which then takes us into, are you ready? This is the most exciting label of all, ordinary time. The seasons after Epiphany, after Easter, after Pentecost, where we just engage in this long obedience in the same direction. Brothers and sisters, that's what discipleship is. We find ourselves strengthened by passages like Psalm 120 all the way to Psalm 134, understanding that we are headed somewhere else. Paul Tournier has this idea of how we live in between certain things. He says, he describes an experience of being in between the time we leave home and arrive at our destination, between the time we leave adolescence and arrive at adulthood, between the time we leave doubt and arrive at faith. And then he says this, it's like the time when a trapeze artist lets go the bar and hangs in midair, ready to catch another support. It is a time of danger, of expectation, of uncertainty, of excitement, and extraordinary aliveness. brothers and sisters, we live in between leaving to follow Jesus and heading towards the promised land, and we find ourselves similarly on a journey. This is what all the scriptures describe. I love Eugene Peterson's translation of Hebrews 12, 1 and 2. He says this: do you see what this means? All these pioneers that he's described in chapter 11, Abraham, Noah, all of these people of faith in the Old Testament, all these pioneers who blazed the way, all these veterans cheering us on, it means we better get on with it. Strip down, start running, and never quit. No extra spiritual fat, no parasitic sins. Keep your eyes on Jesus, who both began and finished the race we're in. Jesus is the road that we take, that we follow as we go towards the presence of God, all things being made new. But we are on this journey of discipleship. And what these Psalms, these 15 Psalms will do for us is they will teach us what it looks like to be oriented toward where we are headed rather than where we are coming from or where we are presently. Okay? Think about that with me again. What the Songs of Ascent will do for us is they will show us what it looks like to be oriented by our destination and not by our past and not by our present, but to be oriented by where we are headed. I'm coming off a pretty difficult week, just with weather-related things. We had a pipe break at church, and just kind of getting to that place where as we start to figure out what post-COVID life is going to be like, we're kind of now able to start to assess the losses that we've endured, just as people and even as a local congregation. And all of that, in a lot of ways, kind of at the beginning of the week, had really just hit me in a pretty tremendous way. And thanks be to God that I've got a lot of people in my life. Not a lot of people in my life. I've got 2 or 3 really, really good friends. I call them first name contacts, like in your phone. Like, you have people in your life where in their contact information in your phone, you can just kind of put their first name. And that's all you need. You don't need more than that. You don't need their last name. You don't need any other notes. You know that that is a person who you know by their first name. Now, I hope to be that for some people, but with a common name like David, my last name usually has to get included in your contacts. But for me, one of my first name only contacts, and it's helpful because he has a unique name, is Galen. Okay? Galen, who lives actually north of Dallas, they've been kind of dealing with some of the weather that we're more used to here. So he and I have been on the phone kind of talking about navigating cold weather and snow and frigid temperatures, and then just having a very, very difficult couple of days at the beginning of the week. I just gave Galen a call, and he took my call right away, and we just began to talk, and I began to explain to him some of the things that I was feeling and some of the things that I was doing and just what I was going through. And he listened, and he agreed, and he empathized, and he listened, and he listened, and he listened, and he didn't really give him any answers except for this one phrase that really affected me in a very significant way. He said, "David, I'm sad for present David, but I'm happy for future David." He said, "I'm sad for present David, but I'm happy for future David." And what he meant by that was the difficulty, the suffering, the disappointment, the pain that I was going through emotionally during those couple of days was actually something that from his perspective, he could see there's good things that are going to come from this. There is a better future that we can choose to be oriented toward rather than being enslaved to the pain of the present crisis. Brothers and sisters, I hope that that's what Psalm 120 will begin to do for us tomorrow as we walk through some simple meditations on each of these things, each of these psalms. I want each of these psalms for us to be considered like a footprint on the journey. William Faulkner says this: they are not monuments. He's not talking about Psalms 120 to 134, but I want us to think of what he says in light of that. They are not monuments, but footprints. A monument only says, at least I got this far, while a footprint says, this is where I was when I moved again. Brothers and sisters, I know many of us are feeling like Psalm 25 told us on this first weekend of Lent. We're feeling enlarged hearts. We're feeling burdened by troubles, by anxieties, by things that trouble us. And oftentimes, and there's seasons for this, that difficulty, that pain needs to cause us to stop. Brothers and sisters, perhaps Psalm 120 and the subsequent Psalms for you and for me, can be footprints. They can be for us the place where we start to move again. May God's grace empower us to follow Jesus through the Songs of Ascent. Thank you so much for joining me for this first introduction to our series on the SBC Daily Word called the Psalms of Ascent. May grace and peace and everything good be yours.